Hello and welcome to the Alpha Edge Podcast, the show for men over 50 who refuse to fade out, slow down, play small, or settle for average. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm a healthy aging expert, coach, and founder of the Alpha Edge, and I am here to help you get and stay strong in every dimension of your life, physically, mentally, emotionally, morally, and spiritually. You're here because you're ready to reclaim your power, to own your masculinity, and lead your life with strength and purpose. If you're ready to sharpen your edge, revive your drive, and lead like a man who's built for more, you're in the right place. All right, man, let's get after it. Okay, man, let's go. I think I probably need to be careful how I tread here in today's episode. I mean, seriously, I think this kind of a conversation that I'm getting ready to have with you guys can go sideways pretty quick in today's, let's just say, culture. And unfortunately, I think a whole lot of people have taken this conversation sideways. So before we get started here, let me just go on record. Let me make something absolutely crystal clear. I love women. I love femininity. I love mothers. I love wives. In particular, I love my wife. I love softness. I love nurturing energy. I love compassion. I love beauty. I love warmth. I love all of that sacred femininity. And I am not, and that is in capital N-O-T, I am not in the least bit interested in becoming some angry middle-aged dude screaming into a microphone about how modern women have ruined society. So, that's not what this episode is. This is not red pill rage. This is not MGTOW. If you don't know what that is, that's men. What is that? Men going their own way, I think. It's not MGTOW nonsense. This is not any of that manosphere idiocy that seems to be infecting social media right now. This is not women are bad kind of lecture. And this is not a call to return to some sort of fantasy version of 1950s where everybody wore suits and somehow all human problems magically disappeared, because that's not reality. But I do think that we are living through the consequences of a culture that has lost balance. And specifically, I think we are witnessing what happens when masculinity disappears, weakens, or becomes demonized. I'm not talking about toxic masculinity, not abusive masculinity, not violent masculinity, certainly. I'm talking about grounded, healthy, disciplined, protective, responsible masculinity. The kind of masculinity that builds civilizations, that raises children, that protects families, that creates order out of chaos, that carries heavy burdens without complaining, without collapsing. Because here's what I've been thinking a lot about lately. What happens to a society when boys grow up without fathers, without initiation, without older men guiding them into adulthood, without anyone teaching them what masculine strength is actually for? I mean, what happens when young men are told from childhood, don't be too aggressive, don't be too competitive, don't be too loud, don't be too masculine, just be nice, be a nice boy. And look, there's absolutely nothing wrong with teaching boys kindness and empathy, but if kindness is not paired with things like courage and strength and discipline and responsibility, you don't create good men. You create fragile men. You create passive men. You create weak men. Men who need constant validation. Men who avoid conflict. Men who drift. Men who never fully grow up. And I know this because in a lot of ways, I was one of them. I was the poster child for this. So my parents divorced when I was young. I was a young teenager. My mother became my primary role model, and my mother loved me deeply, still does. But she could not teach me how to become a man because she wasn't one. And that realization really changed the trajectory of my life. So today, I want to talk about concepts like fatherlessness. I want to talk about the collapse of masculine initiation. I want to talk about the imbalance between masculine and feminine energy in today's culture. And I want to talk about what mature men, what should we do in a society that increasingly seems confused about masculinity itself. I don't want to have this conversation with anger. I don't want to have this conversation with even a touch of bitterness, but I do want to have this conversation with honesty because I think a lot of men feel this. I think a lot of guys are feeling this, even if they don't quite know how to articulate it. So I'm inviting you to join me and let's walk carefully into this minefield together. All right, guys, so let's go here. I want to start with a personal story because I think this issue becomes dangerous when we only talk about it, say, politically or culturally or academically, but never honestly. And honestly, I understand this topic from the inside. Like I said, my parents divorced when I was a young teenager. And look, this isn't going to be some sort of bash my parents segment. My mother is a good woman. She loved me deeply. She sacrificed for me. She loved me in my darkest moments. That woman loved me when I was unlovable. And she did the best she could with what she had. So I want to say that first and foremost, absolutely clearly. But looking back now as a grown man, I can also see something else. When my father disappeared from the home, something disappeared from my development as well. And at that time, of course, I didn't have language for it. I just adapted, like boys often do, right? And in my case, I maladapted. But my mother became my primary emotional compass, my primary authority figure. She was my primary source of validation. She was my primary model for what a quote-unquote good person looked like. And because she was a woman, the traits that were most rewarded were typically feminine-coded traits. So there are things like be nice, be agreeable, be safe, be polite, don't upset people, don't be too aggressive, don't be too wild, don't be too confrontational. And look, again, none of those things are inherently bad. The world needs kindness. The world needs empathy. The world needs emotional intelligence. But boys also need something else. They need challenge. They need discipline. They need friction. They need standards. They need correction. And they need to be tested. They need to have something they can test themselves against. And they need older men to look them in the eye and say, you're capable of more. Stop whining. Get back up. Control yourself. Lead. Protect. Build. Finish what you started. And to be honest, I didn't really have much of that. So I became what I think a lot of modern boys become. And that's a quote unquote nice young man, a nice guy, if you will, who was deeply dependent on external validation, especially female validation. And man, I'm here to tell you that can create some conflict. That can create some confusion, because if your identity becomes built around being liked instead of being, let's say, respectable, you start shaping your behavior around approval. You do things like you avoid conflict, you soften your opinions, you become overly accommodating, you become emotionally dependent, you become afraid to disappoint people. And I'm here to tell you guys, that was me to a T as a young man. And the crazy part, from the outside, everybody thinks you're a quote unquote good guy. Again, you're a nice guy, right? But internally, it's been my experience that what you're feeling most commonly is anxiousness and uncertainty and approval seeking, and you're disconnected from your own strength. And I'm going to go out here on a limb and say a whole lot of y'all listening to this understand exactly what I'm talking about. Because this isn't just about divorced parents. This is what happens when masculine formation disappears. And look, guys, the statistics here are actually brutal. We now have approximately 18 million children in the United States living without fathers. And the outcomes associated with fatherlessness are not pretty, not at all. There's higher rates of depression, there's higher rates of substance abuse and behavioral problems, and incarceration and suicide and poverty, all of that, dropping out of school, all of that really strongly associated with fatherlessness. Now, obviously, not every single child from a single parent household is doomed. Not even close. That's not what I'm saying. So don't take that out of context either. There are extraordinary single mothers doing heroic work every single day. My mom was one of those, right? But I think we've become so afraid of offending people that we can't say even the most obvious things anymore, the most obvious facts. Things like fathers matter, like a lot. Deeply, not because mothers are somehow insufficient, but because mothers and fathers bring different gifts to human development. And healthy culture needs both of those. A mother often teaches a child that they are loved. A father often teaches a child that they are capable. A mom is going to nurture where a dad often initiates. Where mother comforts pain, father often teaches endurance through pain. And when one of those forces disappears entirely, I think everything becomes lopsided. And I think that what's happened is now we are living in a culture that's filled with grown men who were never fully initiated into mature masculinity. Not evil men, not hateful men, just, I don't know, let's call them unfinished men. So I want to talk about what I call a boy crisis. And when I say boy crisis, I'm not talking about some kind of crazy conspiracy theory. I'm just talking about observable reality. Something is happening to young men, and I think most honest people can feel this. We are watching rising anxiety, rising depression, rising loneliness, rising addiction, rising passivity, rising confusion. And we have this entire generation of young men drifting without any purpose. Heck, we got a whole generation of older men still drifting without purpose. And not all men, obviously, but enough men that it's becoming, shall we say, culturally visible or culturally obvious. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is reducing this conversation, like reducing it to politics, because this is much deeper than politics. This is developmental. This is spiritual. This is cultural. This is civilizational, if that's even a word. I think I might have just made that up. But once again, before somebody clips this out of context and loses their mind online and I get canceled, this is not about blaming women. Not at all. I think men created much of the mess we're in right now. And let's be honest here. Men abandoned families. Men chased selfishness. Men avoided responsibility. Men disappeared. Men outsourced parenting. Men prioritized pleasure over leadership. So this is not a victim narrative, far from it. I think that men bear enormous responsibility for the current state of masculinity. But that doesn't change the reality that boys need men. And when boys don't get masculine guidance, culture's going to rush in and fill up that vacuum. Usually very, very badly. Now think about the average modern boy. He's going to grow up in this fatherless or emotionally disconnected home. And then he's going to enter a school system where roughly 3/4 of the teachers are female. Again, this is not an attack on female teachers. Some of the best teachers I ever had were women, so before anybody gets upset with that. But let's at least acknowledge something very obvious here. Boys and girls are not identical. Generally speaking, boys tend to be more physical, more aggressive, more impulsive, more risk-taking, risk-oriented. They're more competitive, and they're quite often slower to mature emotionally. And increasingly, those traits are treated less like traits to shape and more like problems to suppress. So we hear teachers say things like, sit still, be quiet, stop roughhousing, stop competing, stop being disruptive, take this medication, tone it down. Meanwhile, boys are falling behind academically, they're struggling psychologically, and they're increasingly disconnecting from real-world responsibility. And I'm here to tell you, when that happens, instead of initiation into manhood, they get initiated by the internet, by pornography, by algorithms, by gaming and gaming addiction, by social media and by influencer, by rage politics and isolation, escapism, etc., etc. And look, if no strong male mentor intervenes in that young man's life, a boy can easily become one of two things, either passive and weak or angry and undisciplined. And honestly, I think the rise of some of these ridiculous extreme online manosphere movements is probably a result of young men desperately searching for some sort of masculine direction. The problem is, when healthy masculinity disappears, this fake counterfeit masculinity rushes in to fill the void. And that's important because young men want purpose. Young men want challenge, maybe subconsciously, maybe they don't even know consciously they want, but they do. They're hungry for challenge. They want initiation. They want meaning. They want strength. And if wise men don't guide them, I can promise you some fool's going to rush in and guide them. That's our danger. So let's talk about some realities connected to these fatherless households here. So here in the U.S., I think it's 25% of all households are fatherless with children in them. Children from single-parent families are significantly more likely to struggle with mental health issues. 85% of children who exhibit behavioral disorders come from fatherless homes. 70% of juveniles in state-operated institution come from single-parent homes. 63% of youth suicides come from fatherless homes. Now, again, that does not mean that every single child without a father is doomed. Absolutely not even remotely. But it does mean that fathers are not optional. And I think somewhere along the line, our culture started pretending masculine presence in the home was optional. It was interchangeable. And obviously, I don't think that's true at all. I think boys need men who challenge them, men who model emotional control, men who demonstrate sacrifice, men who teach what it looks like to live responsibly, men who show strength without cruelty, men who embody calmness under pressure, because masculinity is not inherently dangerous. Maybe undisciplined masculinity is dangerous, but absent masculinity is dangerous as well. And I think that many modern boys are growing up terrified of becoming quote unquote bad men, but with absolutely no idea how to become good men. I think that's our crisis here. And until we're willing as a society, as a culture, to talk honestly about it, I think this drift is just going to continue here. So let's talk here about the feminization of our culture, the feminization of our institutions. And now this is probably where I need to tread really carefully so I don't get booted off of the podcast platform or YouTube or anything, get canceled, because I think the internet has completely destroyed people's ability to have these nuanced, honest conversations. The second you even mention differences between masculine and feminine tendencies, people immediately lose their minds and start assuming you're saying that women shouldn't work, women shouldn't leave, women are the problem, or you're a misogynist. Look, I'm not saying anything even remotely like that. Women contribute enormous value to our society. Healthy femininity is essential to culture and to civilization. And many women today are carrying unbelievable burdens with incredible strength and grace, okay? But I do think we need to ask an uncomfortable question here. What happens when nearly every major institution in culture begins rewarding primarily feminine-coded behaviors while simultaneously increasingly discouraging masculine ones? And now, before everybody panics here, let me define what I'm talking about here. Generally speaking, and yes, of course, there are exceptions to everything, but generally speaking, feminine energy tends to prioritize things like safety, consensus, emotional sensitivity, emotional intelligence, inclusion, comfort, harmony, and relational awareness. And guys, those are good things. Those are beautiful things. Healthy society needs those things. Now let's look at masculine energy. Again, generally speaking, tends to prioritize things like risk, competition, hierarchy, mission, strength, discipline, stoicism, decisiveness, confrontation when necessary. Healthy societies need those things too. So let me be clear here. The problem is not femininity. The problem is imbalance. Because when masculine virtues become viewed with, shall we say, suspicion, boys start learning very early that their natural impulses are somehow defective. A little boy is loud and competitive and physical. He's restless and he's aggressive. He wants to wrestle. He wants to climb. He needs to test boundaries. He needs to take risks. He needs to compete. And increasingly, the message he receives is that energy is dangerous. That energy is toxic. That energy needs to be suppressed. Now, look, I'm not talking about defending abusive behavior. I'm not defending bullying. I'm not defending cruelty. Obviously not. Masculinity absolutely requires discipline and moral formation. But there is a huge difference between disciplining and shaping masculine energy and shaming masculine energy. And I really think that modern culture is confusing the two, because aggression itself isn't bad. It's not evil. Uncontrolled aggression is bad. Uncontrolled aggression is evil. But disciplined aggression, that's the force that protects children. That's the force that fights fires and defends nations. That's the force that builds businesses. That's the force that stands up to evil and carries families through hardship. A firefighter running into the burning building is using aggression. The father who is confronting a threat against his family is using aggression. A man who says, no, absolutely not, this stops here, is using aggression. Masculine energy, properly ordered, becomes protection. But instead of teaching boys how to channel masculine energy, our culture and our institutions are increasingly teaching them to distrust it altogether. And that's going to create confusion. That's going to create shame. And then you layer on top of that our social media and our universities and our corporate culture and the online outrage culture and these ideological echo chambers. And young men begin receiving the message that masculinity itself is inherently bad. It's inherently suspect, that being assertive is dangerous, that leadership is somehow oppressive, that competitiveness is absolutely unhealthy, that stoicism is emotional repression, that strength is threatening. And eventually, most boys are going to do one of two things. They're either going to suppress their masculinity entirely, or it's going to come bursting out sideways in these unhealthy, unwanted ways. So we've got passivity on one side, and then maybe, let's just call it rage on the other side. Neither of those is healthy masculinity, not even close. And here's where I think mature men need help, or we need wisdom, because I do not believe the answer is women need to step aside. That's absolutely absurd. But I think the answer is this: men do need to step up. We need to take responsibility. We need strong men, grounded men, disciplined men. We need moral men. We need responsible men, men who are calm and not chaotic, men who are protective without being abusive, men who are convicted and not insecure, men who are strong enough to lead without feeling the need to dominate, because healthy masculinity and healthy femininity are not enemies. They're complementary forces, and culture becomes unstable when either one of those disappears. And right now, I think we're living through what happens when masculine formation collapses, while simultaneously teaching boys to feel ashamed of the very traits that could make them great men, could make them capable men. And I think so many young men are starving for someone to finally say, your strength is not the problem. Your lack of discipline is the problem. Your masculinity is not toxic. Your undeveloped masculinity needs to be harnessed, because without any sort of discipline, it's just dangerous. And there's a big difference in that. So I think one of the biggest culprits here, and why we're in this mess, one of the biggest missing pieces in modern culture is initiation, like initiation from boyhood to manhood. I think that I don't think this is talked about nearly enough. I mean, it is talked about on the fringes in men's group, but I don't think it's talked about in popular culture nearly enough, because throughout all of human history, boyhood and manhood were not considered the same thing. A boy was not automatically viewed a man simply because he got a certain age or because he got older. Manhood had to be earned. It had to be tested. It had to be proven. It had to be bestowed. And almost every civilization that's ever existed understood this very well. Ancient tribes had rites of passage. Warrior cultures had trials. Religious traditions had ceremonies. Young men were mentored by elders. They faced hardships, and responsibility was placed upon them, and they were challenged physically and emotionally and spiritually. And at some point, a young man crossed a threshold. The culture essentially said, look, you are no longer a child. You now carry responsibility. Now others depend on you. Now your life is no longer just about you. And I think that modern culture has completely lost that. Completely lost that process. Because today what we see is this extended adolescence indefinitely. I see this all the time as I look around at adult men. We have these grown-ass men who are biologically adults, but they are psychologically still boys. They're still teenagers. And look, again, I'm not preaching this because, from some pedestal. I spent the better part of my adult years there myself. I suspect a lot of us have. Because modern culture gives boys endless escape routes from responsibility. We have pornography, video games, social media. We have endless entertainment on demand. We got hookup culture. We got comfort addiction and just perpetual distractions. But here's the thing. None of those things require any amount of initiation. None of them demand transformation. A boy can drift for years now without ever truly becoming accountable to anything larger than himself. No mission. No responsibility, no discipline, no sacrifice, no older man calling him higher. And eventually that drift starts to cement into identity. And I really think that this is one of the reasons why so many men feel lost today. Not because they're bad, not because they're dumb or stupid, but because nobody ever initiated them. Nobody ever looked them in the eye and said, man, you are capable of carrying weight. You are needed. The world requires something from you. Your impulses must now come under discipline. Your life is no longer about comfort. And without some sort of initiation process, I think guys remain trapped in what I'll just call extended boyhood. A whole lot of guys out there with adult bodies in teenage psychology. And man, you see this everywhere. Men are terrified of commitment. Men are avoiding responsibility. Men are addicted to stimulation. Men are emotionally fragile. Men are unable to endure even the smallest amount of discomfort. Men are chasing validation instead of purpose. because initiation historically did something critical. It killed that child-centered mindset. That's what initiation really did. And it's the death of selfishness. It's the death of passivity. It's the death of dependence. It's the death of entitlement. And in its place, something stronger is born. Duty and restraint, responsibility, service, mission, steadiness. That's the transition to manhood. Not any kind of machismo or chest-thumping nonsense, certainly not domination, but responsibility. And that's why I believe healthy masculinity is fundamentally, it's sacrificial. A mature man carries burdens voluntarily. He protects, he provides, he leads, he serves, he endures, he sacrifices, even when he doesn't feel like it. And I think so many modern men are exhausted because deep down, they know they haven't crossed that threshold yet. Their body gets older, but their soul was never initiated into manhood. Historically, initiation was always guided by older men. So these are the elders and the fathers and the warriors and the mentors and the spiritual leaders. These are men who had already suffered. These are men who had already failed and already learned restraint and had already built wisdom. And they passed it on in a rite of initiation. Today, most young men are just trying to initiate themselves through the internet. And that is going terribly, horribly. That's just a terrible experiment because algorithms cannot form character and influencers cannot replace fathers. This is why mature masculine leadership matters so much right now, because boys do not automatically become good men with age. They become older versions of whatever habits, wounds, impulses, and beliefs remain unchallenged. You feel me on that? And if nobody calls these guys upward, they're not going to rise, which raises a very important question. If modern culture no longer initiates boys into manhood, then whose responsibility is it now? And I think you see where I'm going with this. I think it's ours. I think it's mine. I think it's yours. Okay, so let's talk about one of the greatest tragedies here in modern culture is that modern boys are growing up believing there's something inherently wrong with masculine strength itself, with masculinity itself. I know I talk about this all the time, but it's like masculinity is automatically dangerous. It's automatically oppressive. It's automatically toxic. And of course, I reject that completely because when masculinity is healthy, I think it's one of the most stabilizing forces on this planet. Healthy masculinity protects. Healthy masculinity builds. Healthy masculinity sacrifices. It restrains violence rather than unleashing it. It carries responsibility voluntarily. Folks, that ain't toxic. That's civilization. And now, yes, let's be honest, corrupt masculinity 100% absolutely exists. Abusive men exist. Violent men exist. Selfish men exist. Domineering men exist. Cowardly men most certainly exist. Men who use strength to intimidate instead of protect absolutely 100% exist. But here's an important distinction. That is not masculinity fully formed. That is masculinity undisciplined, immature, or just morally corrupted, right? And frankly, I think that we've made a massive cultural mistake by treating masculinity itself as a disease instead of asking why so many men became disordered in the first place. Because if boys are never initiated, never mentored, never disciplined, never taught purpose, never taught emotional control, never taught responsibility, then of course masculine energy is going to become chaotic. It's going to look dangerous. It's going to look messy. But trained power, disciplined power, moral power, that's a man who runs towards danger when everybody else is running away. That's a husband who stays when his family is falling apart. That's the father working 2 jobs quietly without complaint. That's the man who controls his emotions instead of dumping them on everyone around him. That's the man who tells the truth even when it costs him something. Guys, that's masculinity. And I think a lot of modern men are deeply confused because culture gives them 2 horrible options. Option number 1, suppress your masculinity entirely. Become soft, become passive, become hyper agreeable. Never offend anyone. Never lead, never challenge, never take up space. Or option 2 is this ridiculous cartoonish version of masculinity. You're arrogant and aggressive and emotionally shut down and obsessed with domination and money and status or women. And look, none of those are mature masculinity. Not even close. One is weak and the other's insecure. Real masculinity is grounded. It's discipline, strength, under control. And one thing I've learned as I've gotten older is this: the strongest men in the room are usually the calmest. They don't need constant validation. They don't need to posture. They don't need to dominate every conversation. They don't need everybody to know how tough they are, because true strength is stable. And I think this is where the conversation around masculinity is getting distorted today. We tend to think masculinity means loud and aggressive and machismo and control. But healthy masculinity is actually deeply sacrificial. It says, I will carry the burden. I'm going to stay steady. I'm going to protect. I'm going to provide. I'm going to endure discomfort so that others can feel safe. I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to lead with integrity. I'm going to control myself. And look, guys, that last one is huge, because masculinity without self-control 100% absolutely becomes toxic, right? But masculinity with self-control becomes incredibly beautiful and incredibly valuable. And here's something else I think we desperately need to say to young men right now. Your desire to become strong is not bad. Your desire for purpose is not evil. Your competitive drive is not bad. Your aggressive nature is not bad. Your masculinity is not bad. It simply must be directed, disciplined, and placed in the service of something meaningful. Because strength without morality becomes tyranny, but morality without strength becomes helplessness. Healthy men need both, right? We need that strength and we need that morality. And honestly, I think that a lot of the chaos we see in modern culture is not the result of too much masculinity. I think it's a result of too little mature masculinity. Too few fathers, too few mentors, too few grounded men willing to lead calmly and courageously. Which means the solution here is not shaming men into weakness. The solution is calling men upward into responsibility. So if everything we talked about today is true, if fatherlessness matters, if masculine formation matters, if initiation matters, if culture is struggling because too many boys never fully become men, then the obvious question is, okay, now what? What are mature men supposed to do about this? What am I supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? And honestly, I think this is where the conversation either becomes useful or just turns into another angry rant on the internet. Because look, as I said, I am not interested in building an audience of bitter men blaming women or blaming culture, blaming the other side, or blaming everybody else for their lives. Absolutely not. I think that's weakness. Complaining is not leadership. Bitterness is not leadership. So then the question is, what must we as mature men become? So I've got a few things for you here. First, I believe we must become grounded, not reactive, not emotionally chaotic, not perpetually outraged, but grounded. We should be calm under pressure. We should exhibit emotional steadiness. We should be capable of thinking clearly, even when the world is really chaotic and noisy. Because one of the things I notice about modern culture is that everybody is emotionally activated all the time. Everybody's angry. Everybody's offended. Everybody's performing outrage for intention. Look, that's a child's game, right? Mature men cannot lead from emotional chaos. We just can't. We need our nervous systems to be regulated. We need to be thinking clearly. We need to exhibit self-control. We need to have conviction without hysteria. That matters. Second, I think we must become physically capable again. And no, I'm not saying that every man needs to look like an action movie star. Be cool if you did, though. But men should absolutely be physically competent. We should take care of ourselves. We should be strong enough to help and strong enough to protect. We should be strong enough to endure hardship and to carry responsibility. Your physicality affects your psychology. 100%. When men become weak physically, they very often become weaker mentally and emotionally and spiritually as well, which is why I believe strength training is about far more than just aesthetics. It's going to teach you discipline and consistency and resilience and delayed gratification. It will teach you humility and endurance. It teaches guys to voluntarily do hard things, and guys, that matters. Third, I think mature men must become leaders inside of their own homes first. Not dictators, leaders. And leadership starts with example. You cannot demand discipline from your kids while living without discipline yourself. You cannot demand emotional stability while constantly losing control emotionally yourself. You cannot ask your family to trust your leadership if you are passive or checked out or distracted, addicted, or perpetually drifting. Leadership is earned through consistency, from showing up quietly over time. And I think so many guys today are starving for responsibility because responsibility gives life meaning. Purpose is found in service. Fourth, I think, guys, we need to mentor young men. I think this is huge. This is missing. I think one of the saddest realities here in modern culture is that so many boys are growing up without wise older men anywhere in their lives. No fathers, no coaches, no mentors, no initiation, no guidance. And then we wonder why they turn to online influencers and algorithms for identity. Young men need older men, not perfect men, not celebrity men, not hyper alpha goofiness, but honest, grounded, disciplined men willing to say, hey, look, I made some mistakes too. Let me help you avoid some unnecessary suffering. That mentorship matters enormously. And I think many mature men underestimate how valuable their presence alone can be. Sometimes a younger man simply needs some encouragement, needs some challenge, needs some accountability, needs some self-belief, needs someone to model emotional steadiness and integrity. And guys, that can change a life. And then finally, fifth, I think mature men, we've got to reject both passivity and bitterness. Because again, I think so many guys today are swinging between these two very unhealthy extremes. One extreme is passivity. You're avoiding responsibility. You're avoiding conflict and leadership and challenge. And then we have that other extreme over here, and that's resentment. That's bitterness. That's anger towards women, anger towards culture, anger towards the younger generation, anger just towards the world in general. Neither of these is going to create any sort of wise masculinity, any sort of good masculinity. The goal is not domination. The goal is service through strength. And I think mature masculinity, ultimately, it's going to look like this. It's a dangerous man who has that dangerous component of him, he's got it under voluntary control. This is a man capable of aggression who chooses restraint. This is a man capable of leadership, but who remains humble. This is a man who's capable of strength, but uses it to protect rather than to intimidate. Guys, that's what mature masculinity looks like. And I think the world is desperate for men like that right now. That's what our culture needs. That's what's wrong. Not louder men, not performative men, and certainly not any more angry men. We got enough of those, but stronger, steadier, wiser, more grounded men. Men who quietly carry responsibility while everybody else is busy arguing online. Because cultures aren't going to heal through outrage. They heal when mature men decide to lead again. All right, so I don't want to sound too apocalyptic here, but because I don't think civilization's coming to an end tomorrow, next week. I don't think that all hope is lost, and I don't think that every young man today is doomed. I think there's incredible young men and young men out there right now. In fact, I've met some of them recently. Thoughtful young men, disciplined young men, faithful young men, hardworking young men. But I do think that there are some warning signs that we would be foolish to ignore right now. Because when societies lose strong masculine formation long enough, things start to fracture. And honestly, I think that's where we are right now. We're seeing it all around us. There's rising loneliness, rising anxiety. We have falling birth rates. We have delayed adulthood, certainly. We have commitment avoidance. We have pornography addiction. We've got identity confusion. We've got social isolation. We certainly have lack of meaning. We've got this declining resilience. And perhaps most concerning of all is there's a growing number of men who simply seem disconnected from purpose altogether. I see it all the time. Dudes that are drifting, they're existing instead of building. They're consuming instead of creating. They're escaping instead of leading. And look, this isn't just happening to men. Women are suffering too, because when masculinity disappears, women often end up carrying enormous emotional and financial and parental burdens alone. And then children suffer, and then families suffer, and then community suffers. Culture suffers. Everybody suffers. And I think one of the most dangerous lies modern culture tells us is that men are optional. That is the most dangerous lie in modern culture right now, that fathers are interchangeable, that masculinity is merely a social construct, that strong male leadership is somehow outdated or oppressive. Look, I don't buy that for a second. I think healthy masculine presence creates stability, not superiority, but stability. And when stability weakness, I'm here to tell you, chaos rushes in and expands and fills up that void. Now, let me say something else here really carefully. A society that does not know how to initiate boys into meaningful manhood eventually is going to create one of two outcomes: weak men or predatory men. because immature masculinity doesn't simply disappear. It's going to mutate, sometimes into passivity, sometimes into addiction or narcissism or rage or manipulation or violence. And that's why this conversation matters, because ignoring masculinity does not eliminate masculine energy. It just leaves it undisciplined. And undisciplined power becomes scary, becomes dangerous, and not in the good way that I'd like to talk about dangerous usually. But here's another warning that concerns me. I think many men today are becoming spiritually exhausted, not just physically tired, but spiritually tired. Because deep down, we as men, we know we're built for more than endless entertainment or scrolling or consumption or distraction or comfort. We as men, we want meaning. We want purpose. We want mission. We want brotherhood. We want responsibility. We want challenge. We want transcendence. We want our life to matter. And when culture can't offer meaningful initiation or can't offer meaningful purpose, I think people begin searching for identity in these increasingly unhealthy places like political extremism or online tribalism. We look for identity and ideology, sometimes in addiction, sometimes status chasing or escapism. Look, humans are always going to seek meaning somewhere. The question is whether that meaning elevates them or whether it consumes them. And I think modern institutions are very good at producing consumers. That's how this society is built, but very poor at producing mature, strong human beings. And that's a problem, right? Because civilizations can't survive indefinitely when comfort becomes the highest value. At some point, somebody's going to be willing to sacrifice, to lead, to protect, to endure hardships, to tell difficult truths, to carry burdens voluntarily, and that requires mature masculinity. And if we continue losing that, I think the long-term consequences are dire. I think they're very serious. Not because men are somehow, quote unquote, better, but because men and women are designed to bring different strengths to civilization. And healthy civilization, healthy cultures, they need both. And when either side becomes distorted or imbalanced, or in this case, almost absent, the entire structure weakens. That's the warning. No hatred, no fear-mongering, but just reality. So let's what do we do with this? Let's make this practical here, because if you listen to this episode and you walk away thinking, yeah, this society sure is a mess. Okay, that probably I agree, but not particularly very useful, right? So the real question is this: what are you going to do? Who are you going to become? Because culture changes when people change. Families change when individuals change. I don't think the world needs more men yelling online about masculinity, right? I think the world needs more men quietly embodying it. So here's my challenge for you this week. Stop waiting for culture to initiate you. That ain't going to happen, right? Initiate yourself. Decide consciously that boyhood is over. And I don't care if you're 38 or 48 or 68. Some men age without ever truly stepping into manhood, without ever truly embracing responsibility. Don't let that be you. So this week, I want you to ask yourself just a couple of hard questions. Where in your life are you still avoiding responsibility? Where are you still seeking comfort instead of growth? Where are you dependent on external validation? Where are you passive when you should be leading? Where are you emotionally reactive instead of grounded? Where are you consuming instead of creating? Because mature masculinity is built through responsibility, not from rhetoric, not from podcasts, not from quotes, not from social media posts, but through action, through discipline, through consistency. And the truth is, most of the transformation men are searching for is found in very unsexy daily behaviors, daily habits. Wake up early, train your body, control your impulses, keep your word, tell the truth, lead your family, mentor young men. Get spiritually grounded. Stop numbing yourself. Do hard things on purpose. That's the work. And here's another challenge. Find one younger man that you can encourage this month. Just one. Maybe it's your son or a nephew. Maybe it's a coworker, or maybe a younger guy at church, or maybe it's a struggling younger father or a kid in your neighborhood. You do not need to become some sort of perfect life coach or guru. Most young men are not looking for that. They're just looking for presence. They're just looking for guidance and encouragement and correction and example. And sometimes a young man's life changes simply because one older man finally looked at him and said, I believe you're capable of more. I think that matters, guys. And if for some reason you're listening to this episode as a younger man, I want to challenge you. Stop outsourcing your identity. The internet's not going to tell you who you are. Algorithms cannot initiate you, and chasing comfort is never going to produce strength. So to you, I say, go find a challenge. Go seek responsibility. Go learn from wise older men. Go train your body. Go build discipline. Go become trustworthy. Not performatively masculine, but actually dependable. Because at the end of the day, masculine, again, it's not about dominance. It's about responsibility. That's the standard. Not how powerful can I appear, but how much responsibility can I carry with integrity. That's the kind of strength I'm looking for. That's manhood. And then maybe, just maybe, if enough mature men decide to rise quietly and lead well, the cultures will start healing from the inside out. All right, guys, let's wrap this up. I know today's episode is a little bit of a rant there, so I appreciate you if you're still with me for bearing with me here. To be honest, I rewrote these notes several times before recording this because I know it's a bit of a cultural minefield as well. Wasn't sure how I wanted to say this, but I do think that these conversations have the potential to become ugly very quickly. People get defensive. People get ideological. People stop listening and they shut down. But I don't think that helps anybody. And I certainly don't think being silent about this helps anybody. So if we can no longer have honest conversation about masculinity and fatherhood and initiation and responsibility and the formation of young men, then we should not be surprised when the cultural confusion keeps on deepening. But I want to reiterate something very important here as we're wrapping up. This episode is not about blaming women. It's not about nostalgia for some imaginary perfect past. And it's not about any kind of resentment. This episode is about radical responsibility because mature masculinity is not pointing fingers. It asks, what is mine to carry? That's the shift. And how can I get the strength to carry it? And I think that men listening to this already feel the call towards something deeper, not domination, nothing performative, not some sort of performative toughness, not any of this ridiculous internet alpha nonsense that's going on, something quieter, something stronger, something more grounded. The call to become a man who can actually be relied upon, a man whose family feels safe in his presence, a man who tells the truth, a man who controls himself, a man who carries burdens willingly, a man who leads calmly instead of reactively, a man who becomes strong enough to serve others well and has a mission, has a purpose, knows why he's here. That, my friend, is masculinity at its best. And I think the world desperately needs more of that right now. Definitely not more outrage, not more bitterness, not more chaos, but more steady men, more fathers, more grandfathers, more mentors, more protectors, more builders, more grounded elders willing to guide the younger generation with wisdom instead of, resentment. Because cultures don't collapse all at once. They decay slowly when enough people stop carrying responsibility. And I think the culture heals the exact same way, one man at a time, one father at a time, one family at a time, one young man mentored instead of abandoned, one mature man deciding, look, I'm done drifting. I'm not going to drift through this life half-formed. That matters. And maybe the real initiation in manhood today is choosing responsibility voluntarily in a culture obsessed with comfort, chasing discipline in a culture of distraction, choosing purpose in a culture of consumption, choosing leadership in a culture of passivity. Maybe that's the work. And despite all the problems we talked about today, to be honest, I'm actually hopeful. I'm optimistic because I think there are still many, many good men out there. There are men who are quietly rebuilding themselves, who are working on themselves, men who are becoming stronger fathers, stronger husbands, stronger leaders, stronger human beings. And if enough men continue doing that work, I think the future looks a whole lot brighter than a whole lot of people currently think. Okay, men, that's our show for this week. Don't forget to download our free guide titled How to Raise Your Testosterone Naturally. You can find the download link in the show notes for this episode on whatever app you're listening to this podcast on. If you've enjoyed today's show, here are 3 ways you can support us. Number 1, share this episode with a friend. Number 2, make sure to like and follow this show, and please consider leaving us a 5-star review. Number 3, give us a follow over at Instagram. We're at Alpha Edge Army. So that's Alpha Edge Army all run together. I really appreciate you men taking the time to listen. And until next week, stay strong.